Have you ever noticed how some political figures spend years talking about inequality, victimhood, and social justice, yet live like true monarchs in million-dollar mansions, travel by private jet, and sign multi-million-dollar contracts with publishers and media platforms? They say they are fighting for the people, but in the end, who really benefits from this narrative? The hypocrisy is blatant. The discourse that preaches racial injustice and the fight for equality often hides a game of power and money, where the biggest beneficiaries are not the ordinary citizens, but the very elites who control the narrative. This is no secret anymore, but the big question is, how long will people continue falling for this game? The truth is that many politicians and public figures build their careers by exploiting the discourse of victimization. They say that minorities are constantly being oppressed, that the system is against them, that the rich control everything. But, curiously, these are the very same people who accumulate enormous fortunes while asking the average citizen to accept tax increases and new social restrictions. Let's talk about Barack Obama, for example. In 2008, when he was elected President of the United States, his net worth was estimated at $1.3 million, a considerable amount, but nothing unusual for a senator. Now, years after leaving office, his fortune has already surpassed $70 million, and they tell us that all this came only from books and lectures. Does anyone really believe that? If it were just Obama, we might think it's an isolated case. But no, this pattern is repeated with several political figures. Hillary Clinton, for example, spent years talking about how women are discriminated against in the labor market and in politics. Yet at the same time, she managed to turn her political career into a machine for raising millions, with book deals and lectures that brought in more money than any average worker could imagine earning in several lifetimes. And the Clintons aren't the only ones. The Bidens also have a similar history. Joe Biden, who spent almost his entire life in government, somehow managed to accumulate a massive fortune, with million-dollar contracts appearing out of nowhere. Now let's talk about something that no one seems to want to mention. If these people are really fighting against the oppressive system, then why do they choose to live in the most exclusive and elitist places on the planet? Take, for example, Obama's mansion in Martha's Vineyard, a place known for being one of the most elitist and expensive zip codes in the world, a house valued at more than $12 million, surrounded by other mansions belonging to millionaires and billionaires. But wait a minute, aren't these the same people who talk about white privilege, systemic oppression and discrimination? If they really believed that, shouldn't they be living in more humble neighborhoods, helping their communities? But no, instead they buy houses in the most expensive and exclusive places in the world, far from the very people they claim to fight for. Michelle Obama, for example, recently said that she feels fear every day for her daughters. According to her, her daughters could suffer racial prejudice simply by driving a car. But while she makes these statements, her family is buying more million-dollar properties and signing lecture contracts worth up to $700,000 per event. And it doesn't stop there. The Clintons, for example, raised more than $230 million in lectures and consultancies after leaving the White House. Have you ever wondered why people are willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to hear these lectures? Do they really believe that these political figures have something revolutionary to say? Or are they paying for access, influence, and political favors? This is the real game, a system where politicians turn their careers into a billion-dollar business, using discourses of victimization and inequality to manipulate the masses while accumulating enormous fortunes. If you think this is just a coincidence, then let's talk numbers. Barack Obama charges about $400,000 per lecture. Michelle Obama charges $700,000. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton together have already raised more than $230 million in speeches and consultancy contracts. But it doesn't end there. As soon as they leave office, these public figures receive multi-million-dollar contracts to write books and produce content for media platforms. Right after leaving the presidency, Obama signed a $65 million deal to launch a book. Joe Biden raised $16 million in just 2 years after leaving the vice presidency. And of course, there is another major scheme behind it all: the foundations and charitable institutions that these people create. Supposedly, these organizations are made to help communities and promote social justice. But in practice, They become nothing more than mechanisms to raise and distribute money among political allies and big business figures. The Clinton Foundation, for example, raised hundreds of millions of dollars under the pretext of helping underprivileged communities. But somehow when Hillary lost the election in 2016, the donations plummeted. Do you think that's a coincidence? Now, if you think that this scheme of power and money is limited only to American politicians, think again. This same model is repeated in many parts of the world, where political elites use social justice discourses to enrich themselves while leaving the people increasingly poorer. Meanwhile, we, ordinary citizens, are constantly bombarded with messages of guilt and victimhood. We are encouraged to accept new taxes, more regulations, and the idea that we must give up our freedoms for the greater good. But in the end, the ones who really come out ahead are always the same people. If you still think that all of this is just a conspiracy theory, look at the facts. These people spend their entire lives talking about how the system is racist, unjust, and unequal. Yet, at the same time, they accumulate fortunes, live in mansions, and attend the most exclusive events on the planet. If they truly cared about the problems they claim to fight against, they would be living differently. But the truth is that all of this is nothing more than a grand theater to maintain control and ensure that they continue profiting. In the end, this is not a question of race, inequality, or oppression. It is a question of money, power, and manipulation. They want you to believe that they are victims because while you worry about that, they continue accumulating wealth and power without any consequence. And now I ask you, how many more times will people fall for this game? The most curious part is that these political and media figures who keep talking about equality and social justice are the same ones who avoid any contact with the reality of the ordinary citizen at all costs. They build fences around their mansions, hire private security, and fly on private jets to avoid any kind of inconvenience. Meanwhile, they want the rest of the population to accept more and more restrictions and pay higher taxes to finance the same system that keeps them in power. The game is always the same, convincing people that there is a constant struggle between oppressors and the oppressed, and that only they, the politicians and celebrities, can solve these problems. But in practice, all they do is create more divisions and ensure that they remain on top, never to be questioned. And the most impressive thing is how carefully this narrative is sold through the mainstream media. When someone dares to expose the hypocrisy of these elites, they are immediately labeled as a conspiracy theorist, radical, or extremist. The mainstream media, which should be questioning and investigating these people, has become nothing more than a public relations arm of the system, protecting the interests of those who are really in control. The power of the victimization discourse is enormous because it creates a vicious cycle. When political figures use this strategy to justify their enrichment and influence, they encourage others to do the same. Thus, more and more individuals and groups emerge that profit from promoting social divisions and fueling resentments, while behind the scenes, these same elites continue closing billion-dollar contracts and ensuring that their fortunes keep growing without pause. Have you noticed how these figures constantly talk about distributing wealth, yet they never distribute any of their own? They talk about the oppressed and the marginalized, but live surrounded by luxury, exclusivity, and privileges that the ordinary citizen will never have access to. And when someone exposes this hypocrisy, the response is always the same. This is not about money, it's about social justice. But at the end of the day, you only need to follow the money to understand the true game being played. And the question remains, how long will people accept this without questioning it? The reality is simple. Identity politics and the victimization discourse have become billion-dollar businesses. While political figures accumulate fortunes, the population remains divided, distracted by narratives created to keep them in power. The goal was never social justice, but rather control, wealth, and influence. Now the decision is yours. Will you continue believing the narrative, or will you see the truth? If you want more revealing content like this, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to continue exposing the backstage of the system.